My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and the grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Yesterday in our prayer, Jesus, we talked about food. That complaint of Israel in the wilderness about the manna and how they wanted a change of menu, a menu change. How the people longed for what they left in Egypt, wanting more meat, more leeks and onions, and less heavenly bread. And we saw how we often have this tendency to long for new things rather than accept the wonderful, nay, miraculous gifts that you are already giving us. Well, at the risk of going overboard on the food topic, perhaps we can begin this time of prayer with you, Jesus, considering the question of good food versus bad food. The fact that in our day and age, there's quite a fixation on what are the proper foods to eat and what foods should be avoided. And there's a lot of attention to food. There's even a whole concept of a foodie, someone who knows a lot about food and restaurants, etc. And there's attention to health food, what are called like superfoods, the best regime or diet to consume, the preferences for fast food or slow food, the whole notion of farm to table, our fixation on foods that are fresh, that are healthy, that are organic. And we all know what this means, this fixation on food. I can certainly understand the concern for healthy meals. I remember the times I've eaten fast food at McDonald's and just felt heavy and unwell afterwards. So much grease, so cheap. And the difference of that kind of meal with a well-prepared, healthy, quality meal with fresh ingredients, etc. We all know the value of that. And that's a good development. Right? We're conscientious about our health, and being concerned about our well-being is not a bad thing, but it can become an obsession. So many fads, so much back and forth discussion about the ideal diet, whether that's keto or the paleo diet, what they call the caveman diet, or the Mediterranean diet, intermittent fasting, etc., etc., etc. Again, not bad things in themselves, but isn't it true that we can obsess over these concerns, sometimes at the cost of deeper priorities, deeper needs that we have, intellectual and spiritual? We obsess over health or physique, these kind of material concerns. We fixate on these questions. And Jesus, this brings us to that discussion that you had with the Pharisees, which is the topic for today's gospel. And it has to do with food and questions of cleanliness, of purity, good food versus bad food. And the Pharisees, they also seem to be a bit fixated on this question. Some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem, and they said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They do not wash their hands when they eat a meal." He summoned the crowd and said to them, "Hear and understand. It is not what enters one's mouth that defiles the man, but what comes out of the mouth is what defiles one." Then his disciples approached and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" Jesus, the Pharisees take offense at your words. For the Pharisees, they were concerned and scandalized at your seeming lack of concern with the question of purity. They're fixated on this question of good food versus bad food, the kosher laws. And not only that, whether the food has been prepared properly. and if the person eating is properly prepared. Hand washing was a form of purification, of ritual purity. And the Pharisees, we see this up and down the Gospels. They're constantly scandalized by you, Jesus, because they're so fixated on issues of ritual purity, of cleanliness, of living to the T every dictate of ritual law. And they take offense at you. Why is that? The Pharisees were known as in Hebrew, the perushim, which means the separated ones, those who are separated. The Pharisees felt that they and really all Jews are in a sense separated from the rest of the world, that they are called to live purity in contrast to the impurity of the Gentiles, of the pagans. And the Pharisees placed a lot of emphasis on this as a protective measure. They realized that Israel, and this is true, constantly fell into the pagan practices of their neighbors. And so they felt the need to assure that purity was lived in every level, in every way, by the Jewish people. And this intensified especially after the Babylonian exile, where they lost everything, where Jerusalem fell. And so coming out of that, the Pharisees emerged as a party that protected the purity of the people. Israel must maintain the covenant moving forward, and it's better to shut ourselves off from non-believers, from sinners, than run the risk of losing the covenant again. And so even purity rituals that originally had been intended only for the priests working in the temple, they start to be practiced by all the Jews. The Pharisees are enforcing this among all the Jews, and the rigor becomes more and more intense. And purity, in the eyes of the Pharisees, seems to be a question more of rules and external practices, external manifestations of certain foods, good foods or bad foods, the washing of hands, lists of regulations, etc. And Jesus, you resist this way of thinking, or rather you introduce a new way of thinking. In fact, you're coming to bring a new covenant, a new and definitive covenant sealed in your blood. And so the emphasis that you bring is not so much on ritual purity, but what that purity is supposed to reflect. Interior purity, purity of the heart. And that's why you tell us that it is not what enters one's mouth that defiles the man, but what comes out of the mouth is what defiles one. So it's not what goes into the person, but what comes out of her or him is that really matters. Not so much the food you eat, but the words that you say, the spiritual food that you give out. It's what emerges from us, our thoughts, our words, our actions, our behavior. These are more important than one kind of food or another, from the keto diet or the paleo diet, from whether we have washed our hands or not, although, of course, washing hands is a healthy thing to do. Listen to your mother when she tells you to wash your hands. But rather than worrying about the good or bad foods that we eat, Jesus, help us to realize that we should be praying about the good or bad food, spiritually speaking, that we distribute in our way of treating one another. What kind of food am I giving out, as it were? What kind of thoughts, desires are emerging from my heart? What kind of conversations am I having? What words am I using? What words are coming out of my mouth? Even the way we use our mouth. When we look at someone, do we smile? Are our first words words of comfort, of love, of affection, of concern? That is the real food that we should be concerned about. It's what comes out of the mouth that either defiles us or sanctifies us. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you've communicated to me in this meditation. I ask your help in putting them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.